Nothing is more singular than the destiny of this Gascon cadet, reduced at the highest dignities, suddenly shut up in the Bastille, and succeeding in issuing from it and marrying the legitimate granddaughter of Henri IV, afterwards commanding an army, and next a prisoner for 10 years at Pignerol, receiving his pardon but refusing it, imprisoned for the third time, then exiled, banished apparently forever from the presence of the king, whom he had coarsely insulted, and nevertheless succeeding in finding his way back to Versailles by passing through favorite and victim by turns, without ever being enlightened by its rebuffs or satisfied by it. To obtain these he did not hesitate at any baseness, and the extreme audacity which he sometimes gave proof of was all calculated. He had a certain boldness of mind, but not of heart, for he was naturally mean. Nothing, unless it be the servile humility of his beginning, equaled the insolence with which he avenged himself for his early abasement. Addicted to cruel raillery, prompt in witticisms, he excelled in laying bare and flagellating the absurdities to which he piqued himself on being superior. "He is the most insolent little man," says Lafare, "that has been seen for a century." Devoid of dignity and endowed with prodigious pliability, he did not hesitate to stoop to the lowest parts, and succeeded in affecting the qualities in which he was most deficient. But when, having gained his end, he threw aside the mask and became simply himself again, he inspired contempt. Of all the women seduced by his jargon of gallantry and very deceitful appearances, he did not attach himself to one, and the cousin of Louis XIV, over whom he had first exercised so great a sway, died filled with hatred towards him, and ashamed of such an unworthy husband. But whilst Lauzun was at Pignerol, the illusions of this princess had not yet been dissipated, and her love, increased by separation, manifested itself in loud complaints, in violent scenes, and in attempts to deliver him. Several times she sent agents to Pignerol, who were to try to enter into communication with Lauzun. But they failed in their enterprise, and were driven from the town and forbidden to re-enter it again. On his side, Lauzun, always and everywhere destined to adventures, did not remain inactive. He thought he might be able to escape amidst the disorder and trouble of a fire, and with this intention set light to the flooring of his room. The fire, soon perceived, was, however, at once extinguished. Incapable of resigning himself to his lot, and of seeking some consolation in study, Lauzun, breaking his furniture, gave way to all kinds of outbursts and violence, but without succeeding in moving Saint Mars. Coldly impassible, the latter was equally insensible to the threats of vengeance and to the insults of his prisoner. It was then that, impelled by curiosity, the latter began, this time with patience and without attracting the attention of his gaoler, to make in the wall a hole which should put him into communication with the room situated above his own. We have seen that he succeeded in this, and how he was received by Fouquet. By the same route, and thanks to some precautions, the visits of Lauzun were repeated. But in continuing his confidences, he only confirmed the idea of his madness. It is thus that Fouquet, without putting faith in him, heard him relate how to all the high offices he had obtained, he had almost added one still more elevated, that of Grand Master of the Artillery, and in what manner he had avenged his insuccess. The king had promised him the appointment, and, vain as thoughtless, Lauzun had hastened to announce it, despite the secrecy agreed upon between them. Louvois, soon informed of the projects of Louis XIV, succeeded in diverting him from them by representing to him the disadvantages of such a choice. After several days of vain expectation, the favorite, accustomed to please and hoping to be able to intimidate, watched for and seized upon a tete-a-tete with the king. He dared to call upon him to keep his promise, and Louis XIV, having replied that he was released from it by the indiscretion Lauzun had committed, the latter drew his sword, snapped it in pieces, and exclaimed that he would no longer serve a prince thus capable of breaking his promises. Pale with anger, the king raised his cane, but suddenly mastering himself, he threw it out of the window, saying that he should be very sorry to have struck a gentleman. The next day, Lauzun was taken to the Bastille. Fouquet learned from him, without believing it any the more, a still more audacious adventure. Lauzun had soon left the Bastille and had recovered the king's favor. Beloved by Mademoiselle, he obtained permission to marry her, but vanity again ruined him. Instead of hastening such an unhoped-for union, he wishes to wait, in order that sumptuous liveries may be made, and that the marriage may be solemnly celebrated in the royal chapel, in presence of the whole court, and as between crowned heads. He thus leaves the princes and Madame de Montespan time to act, and Louis XIV, yielding to their representations, withdraws the consent at first accorded. Lauzun, who with reason distrusted Madame de Montespan, despite the assurances of friendship she did not cease to give him, dared, in order to ascertain the truth, to conceive a most dangerous project. Taking for his accomplice the waiting woman of the powerful favorite, he slipped under the bed a little before the king's arrival, and, a witness of their interview, he was able to convince himself that Madame de Montespan was the inveterate enemy to whose advice Louis XIV had yielded. "A cough," says Saint Simon, "the least sound, the slightest accident, might have discovered this rash being, and then what would have become of him? These are things the relation of which stifles and terrifies one at the same time." Fortunately, Lauzun was able to remain motionless. Meeting Madame de Montespan at the ballet, an hour after the interview, he asked her in an agreeable manner whether she had deigned to serve his cause with the king. She replied that, far from having failed to do so, she had taken pleasure, as ever, in extolling his services. Lauzun let her speak at length. Then, suddenly placing his mouth to her ear, he repeated to her, word for word, the conversation which she had just had with the king, and wound up by calling her liar, hussy, and jade. Madame de Montespan succeeded in mastering her confusion, but she never forgot this scene, and a year after, uniting with Louvois, she had brought about the fall of the favorite and his dispatch to Pignerol. Fouquet listened to the narrative of these adventures, which were only too real as one reads an improbable romance. It was only much later that he was convinced by his relations and friends of the veracity of his companion in captivity. But during several years, not doubting his madness, he resigned himself to listen to him out of courtesy, not seeking occasions to see him, but carefully avoiding to contradict him, behaving, in short, toward him as one does towards an unfortunate being afflicted with a mild and harmless but obstinate mania. These two victims of fortune, reunited at Pignerol through such opposite causes, and of whom one was not to leave the place alive, whilst the other was to quit his prison to be again the hero of singular adventures, supported their captivity in a very different manner. Fouquet only thinks of praying to God, writes Saint-Mars on June 20, 1672. He is as patient and moderate as my other prisoner is furious. The outbursts of Lauzun had for their cause not only the failure of his attempts at escape, but also the very arbitrary conduct of Louis XIV, inspired by Louvois. The ex-favorite cruelly expiated the favors of which he had been the object. Not satisfied with depriving him of his liberty, they tried in addition to wrest from him the offices and the immense possessions that an excessive generosity had heaped upon his head, but of which he ought not to have been despoiled by means of the pressure easily put upon a captive. Captain of the bodyguard, he received from Seignelay the invitation to resign this post. Endowed by Mademoiselle with the county of Eu, the duchy of Umalé, the principality of Dombes, and the estate of Thiers, he only recovered his liberty on condition of renouncing all his possessions in favor of the Duc de Maine, natural son of Louis XIV, and Madame de Montespan. At first he angrily repulsed the proposition of Seignelay, and loaded with insults Louvois, whose influence he recognized, and Saint Mars, the interpreter of Seignelay orders. Little by little, however, calmness returned to this spirit, till then so agitated and unquiet. Lauzun understood with reason that everything ought to be sacrificed for liberty, and he hoped one day to be able to return to that culminating point of fortune from which his inconsiderate conduct had precipitated him, and which he was in fact again to attain by a supreme effort of audacity. "At court one must always take one thing with another, everything comes in turn," said Madame de Montespan to the Grande Mademoiselle. Lauzun ended by following this maxim, and, by resigning himself to his lot, at length permitted Saint Mars to taste some repose. The unhappy gaoler had seen himself reduced, by his excessive scruples and by the conduct of Lauzun, to the most singular extremities. Scarcely had Fouquet renounced the hope of escape and given himself up to study and prayer, than Lauzun had come to renew and increase the inquietude of Saint Mars. The ill temper and despair of the new captive were such that he behaved with the utmost violence towards his gaoler. For a long time, insensible to his insults, Saint Mars had at first submitted to them with indifference, but this was soon no longer possible, and he had to discontinue his visits. How then was he to execute the orders received, and exercise his surveillance? The unfortunate gaoler, too much ill-treated to be able to revisit Lauzun, and too scrupulous to leave off watching him, was in a state of extreme perplexity. His alarm was increased by the impossibility of making his usual perquisitions, and he was constantly representing to himself his captive imagining and realizing a project of escape. He at length released himself from this intolerable situation, but at what a price! For a long time the subordinate officials of Pignerol perceived their chief gliding stealthily amongst some trees that surrounded the donjon. Then, choosing the highest and thickest in leaf, overcoming the infirmities of age and recovering for an instant the vigor of youth, he clasped the gnarled trunk, climbed by degrees to the highest branches, and there, hidden by the foliage, kept his eyes eagerly fixed upon Lauzun's room, from which coarse insults had banished him. From this elevated point he observed the prisoner's conduct without being seen by him, and thus reconciled the duties of his office with the exigencies of his dignity. Surely never did a servant better merit the confidence of his master, and Saint Mars will remain without a rival amongst the gaolers of all times. This post of observation ceased to be impenetrable, as Louvois had foreseen. "As the leaves have now fallen," he wrote to Saint Mars, November 10, 1675, "you will no longer be able to see what M.C. de Lauzun does in his room." But this fatiguing surveillance was then rendered less necessary by the resignation and calmness of the so long indocile captive. His submission to the orders of Louis XIV, the proofs of a piety more or less sincere, the entreaties of Madame de Nogent, his sister, and of several friends, obtained for Lauzun the same favors that, for several years past, Fouquet had owed to the accession to power of his friend Arnauld de Pompon, and doubtless also to the increasing influence of Madame de Maintenon. Since 1672, Fouquet had had permission to receive a letter from his wife. Less than 2 years afterwards, he had been allowed to write twice a year to his family. Finally, from January 20th, 1679, the favors were multiplied, and the two illustrious captives obtained all that could soften their situation. Louis XIV authorized them to have full liberty to meet, to take their meals, and to walk together, to converse with the officers of the donjon, and to read all kinds of books and gazettes. Whilst Madame de Nogent and the Chevalier de Logeon received permission to come and visit their brother, Fouquet had at length the happiness of seeing his wife, his daughter, the Count de Vaux, his son, and the Bishop of Agde and M. de Mézières, his brothers. Alone and isolated for 15 years, the surintendant had at last this supreme consolation, which, alas, he was not long to enjoy. These different members of his family made a rather lengthened stay at the citadel, but the prisoner's daughter installed herself there in a definite manner and took up her quarters in rooms directly over those of her father. Almost immediately after her arrival, Lauzun and Fouquet ceased to visit one another. The cause of this sudden misunderstanding is to be found in the gallant disposition and enterprising audacity of Lauzun. The insolent favorite could not recognize the devotion of Fouquet's daughter, a voluntary prisoner and the touching victim of her filial affection. What passed between these three personages can only be surmised, for no documents exist respecting it. It is only known that, long afterwards, Lauzun paid such frequent visits to Mademoiselle Fouquet in Paris, during which he showed himself so familiar that the jealousy of Louis XIV's cousin was very strongly aroused. It was the destiny of the surintendant to undergo every misfortune and, at the moment when he seemed about to receive some alleviation, to find suddenly in his daughter's presence a new source of grief and bitterness. Was this grief at least the final one? Did he die on March 22nd, 1680, as has been said, or to this expiation of his faults courageously undergone during 16 years at Pignerol must a still longer one be added? Did Fouquet continue to drag on his miserable existence for another 23 years? And was it to the Bastille that he went to finish it obscurely, dead to all, his face hidden from the world, and, as it were, surviving even himself? Chapter 18. Theory which makes Fouquet the man with the iron mask. Arguments advanced by M. Lacroix, some to be absolutely rejected and some discussed. Fouquet not in possession of a dangerous state secret. Madame de Maintenon, her character, her youth, her relations with Monsieur and Madame Fouquet, her honorable reserve, the affair of the poisons, how Fouquet's name became mixed up in it, probability of his death being caused by an attack of apoplexy, weakness of the other arguments advanced by M. Lacroix, oblivion into which the surintendant had fallen, two mysterious arrests, a writer of much knowledge and much imagination, M. Paul Lacroix has collected, in a very ingenious and cleverly written work, all the arguments that can be advanced in favor of the theory which makes Fouquet the man with the iron mask. He begins by reminding us of the discovery, announced on August 13, 1789, of a card found amongst the papers of the Bastille, bearing these words, Fouquet, arriving from the Isle Sainte-Marguerite with an iron mask, and signed with 3 X's and the name of Kersadion. Nevertheless, M. Lacroix very properly abstains from counting amongst his proofs a paper, the existence of which is not certified by any official document, and which the wording, the strange manner in which it is said to have been found, and the improbability of any note of this character having been made, must equally cause to be rejected. The following are the more solid bases of M. Lacroix's argument. The precautions employed in guarding Fouquet at Pignerol resemble in every point, says he, those adopted later for the man with the iron mask at the Bastille and at the Isle Sainte-Marguerite. The greater number of the traditions relating to the masked prisoner appear to apply to Fouquet. The appearance of the man with the iron mask followed almost immediately upon the pretended death of Fouquet in 1680. This death of Fouquet in 1680 is far from being certain. Finally, political and private reasons may have determined Louis XIV to cause him to pass for dead in preference to getting rid of him by poison or in any other manner. These 2 last arguments are the only ones which need be discussed, for the circumstantial care, excessive vigilance, and incessant precautions of which Fouquet was the object at Pignerol were not peculiar to this prisoner. Lauzun was treated in absolutely the same manner. The instructions given to Saint Mars every time a new prisoner, even the most obscure, was confided to his care were identical. On July 19, 1669, when announcing the approaching arrival of that Eustache Dauger who was to become Fouquet's lackey, Louvois wrote to Saint-Mars as if the fortune of the state was bound up with this man. When, later, some Protestant ministers, as unknown as they were harmless, are sent to him at the Isle Santa Marguerite, there are the same detailed and complete precautions set forth at length, and equally dear to the circumstantial minister who enjoined them, and the scrupulous gaoler charged with their execution. As to the traditions relating to the masked prisoner, which appear to M. Jarge, Lacroix, to apply to Fouquet, we have seen that the greater number of them are legendary, and that the others, such as the episode of the silver dish thrown from a window, concern several Protestant ministers confined at the Isle Sainte Marguerite at almost the same date as the man with the iron mask. Finally, and we will establish this further on, nothing whatever proves that the appearance of the man with the iron mask dates from the year 1680. But if Fouquet did not die in March 1680, if, above all, Louis XIV had political and private motives for compassing the disappearance of the superintendent by a supposititious death, it is incontestable that the theory of M. Lacroix would have a strong chance of being accepted, since it would show what had become of this personage, while it explained in a very probable manner the mystery, exaggerated by tradition, but nevertheless true, by which the famous masked prisoner was surrounded. This has been perfectly understood by M. Lacroix, who has first applied himself to contest the death of Fouquet in 1680, and then to seek out the different causes that may have determined Louis XIV to suddenly separate the superintendent from the rest of the world, and to make the prolongation of his life a mystery impenetrable to all except Saint-Mars. Of these causes, those which date beyond 1680 must be peremptorily rejected. They could not, in fact, have exercised any influence upon Fouquet's fate, since we have just seen this prisoner pass by degrees from a very close and somewhat harsh confinement to a captivity much softened by favors incessantly multiplied. From 1665 to 1672, he is forbidden all communication, even with his relations, but from 1672 some occasional letters are first authorized, then a more regular correspondence, next daily intercourse with the other prisoners, and, finally, the visit and the prolonged stay of several members of his family at Pignerol. This progress, slow but continuous, incontestably exists in the period extending from 1672 to 1680. It is therefore only in this last year that the origin of the terrible royal anger and of the frightful increase of punishment suddenly inflicted upon Fouquet is to be sought for. And Lacroix has neglected this essential distinction, and has gathered together all the grievances, real or pretended, of Louis XIV, without taking into consideration their ancient date and the evident proofs of indulgent forgetfulness of the past successively shown to the offender. It was therefore superfluous to remind us of the secret negotiations of the superintendent with England, of his projects for rendering himself independent, and of retiring, in case of disgrace, to his principality of Belle Isle, which he caused to be fortified, of his eagerness to gain creatures, whom he bought at any price by appointing them to important offices and giving them secret pensions, or of his pretended love for Mademoiselle de la Vallière. With regard to all these faults, the royal resentment was appeased, and it cannot be admitted that their recollection may have suddenly irritated Louis XIV, when for 8 years he had been manifesting towards the prisoner a clemency more obvious and efficacious. Fouquet, a prisoner at Pignerol, says M. Jar. Lacroix, still excited hatred in Colbert and continual apprehensions in Louis XIV, one would have said that he possessed some great secret, the disclosure of which would be fatal to the state, or at least mortally wound the king's pride. But upon this hypothesis, how was it that Louis XIV authorized the frequent intercourse of Fouquet with Lauzun and afterwards with the different members of his family. How was it that he was not afraid lest these should become participators in, and afterwards propagators of this state secret? So. Lacroix enumerates all the precautions taken by Saint-Mars during the first period of Fouquet's detention in order to hinder him from imparting or receiving intelligence. But 3 significant dispatches show that these precautions, very minute indeed, were only inspired by the fear of an escape, and not at all by the apprehension of the spreading of a state secret. 3 times, and for different causes, Fouquet's valets were dismissed. They were sent away, one in 1665, another at the end of the following year, and the third in 1669. That is to say, when the surintendant was in close confinement. What became of these 3 persons who for a long time had lived with the prisoner and been in a position to receive his confidence? Were they ever deprived of their liberty in order to bury with them this secret which they may have had the misfortune to become acquainted with? "I write you this letter," says Louis XIV, "to Saint-Mars, to tell you that I deem it good that you should give the Sieur Fouquet another valet, and that after the one who is ill is cured, you are to let him go where he pleases, and the present letter being for no other end, I pray God to take you into his holy keeping." "Your letter of the 28th of the past month," writes Louvois to Saint-Mars, "has been delivered to me, and has informed me that the valet of the Sieur Fouquet is afflicted with a very dangerous illness. It is well to continue to have him nursed, and if, after his cure, he does not wish to continue his services to the prisoner any longer, prudence ordains that you should keep him in the donjon 3 or 4 months, in order that if he has transgressed his duty, time may fracture the measures he may have concerted with Monsieur Fouquet. His Majesty leaves it to you," he writes to Saint-Mars in 1669, "to act as you please with respect to La Rivière, that is to say, to leave him with Monsieur Fouquet, or to remove him, His Majesty counting that, in case you remove him, you will only let him depart after an imprisonment of from 7 to 8 months, in order that, if he had taken measures to carry news from his master, it would be so stale by that time that it could cause no annoyance." We see from these dispatches that if, during the 16 years he passed at Pignerol, Fouquet was the object of styles of treatment which differed greatly, it was never impossible for him to render other people depositaries of his secrets, and through them to communicate these secrets to his friends, his relations, or foreign sovereigns, as well as to the great lords of the court. He could have done this in 66, in 66, and in 1669 by means of his servants detained only a few months as prisoners and then dismissed without conditions. He could have done it later still more easily through the medium either of Lauzun or of all those who came to visit him. One must therefore reject the idea that Fouquet was the possessor of a dangerous state secret, and moreover necessarily conclude from the much more humane conduct of Louis XIV towards the surintendant that the king's former resentment had disappeared, and that in 1680 he no longer saw in the prisoner anything but an old man, very interesting both by his misfortunes and his resignation. But M. Lacroix invokes something else besides reasons of state. According to him, the last and the most powerful of Louis XIV's favorites was interested in the surintendant's disappearance. Formerly the latter's mistress, when she was the wife of Scarron, at the moment of her marriage with the king she had exacted from him an increase of rigor towards this troublesome surintendant, that awkward witness of her former weaknesses. Will that which Madame de Sévigné calls the first volume of Madame de Maintenon's life always remain a mystery? And shall we never know the exact beginning of this illustrious parvenu who desired to be an enigma for posterity? Like all those who have had the honor to meet with eager detractors, she has found defenders, unreasonable without doubt, but who have shown the injustice of the passions excited against the ex-Huguenot converted to Catholicism, and afterwards wife of Louis XIV, at the moment of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes and the persecution of the Jansenists. It is the exaggeration of the attack, it is the violence of Saint-Simon, of the Princess Palatine, and of La Fare, rather than any sudden attraction, that has produced this change in public opinion, this current, general today, and highly favorable to Madame de Maintenon. Her rehabilitation was so necessary that everyone has given his adhesion, but only from a feeling of justice. In learning to know her better, one has ceased to despise her, without loving her any the more, and one has conceived much more esteem for her mind than inclination for her person. Never, in fact, even when looking back through ages, does one experience very powerful feelings on behalf of those who were deficient in them, and dry, cold virtue, without the passion that animates and the struggle that vivifies it, will always lack admirers. Madame de Maintenon not only appears austere and inflexible, but everything with her is conventional and calculated. Her piety is not ardent in its outbursts like La Valliere's, but restrained and deliberate, and her scruples always turn to the advantage of her fortune. Not false, but of consummate prudence, not perfidious, but always ready, if not to sacrifice, at least to abandon her friends, loving the appearance of good as much as good itself, without imagination, and consequently without illusions. This woman, superior by the intellect much more than by the heart, was armed against all allurements, and the fear of compromising her reputation placed her beyond all perils. "There is nothing more clever than an irreproachable conduct," said she. "This sentence paints her perfectly, and allows one to penetrate to the bottom of her soul. It explains and enlightens the whole of her life, and by its aid one can understand how this woman managed to live amidst the dangers of a light and frivolous society without succumbing, traverse youth without experiencing its temptations, undergo poverty with honor, hold her own at court, be constant mistress of herself, and end by irrevocably securing in the heart of the king a place which neither La Valliere, despite her disinterested devotion, Fontanger, despite her powers of fascination, nor Montespan, despite her legitimated children, had known how to preserve. To a sound judgment, to a dignity imposing but devoid of arrogance, to that marvelous art of being queen without appearing to pretend to it, and of receiving the homage of the court with quite a Christian humility, to all these qualities by which, as Louis XIV's wife, she showed herself worthy of her destiny, Madame de Maintenon had added, from her most tender infancy, that proud desire for a good reputation, in which lay her strength. "This was my hobby," she said later. "I did not trouble myself about riches. I was infinitely above interest, but I wished for honor. I did not seek to be loved privately by anyone whatever. I wanted to be loved by everybody." Nothing indicates that her firm and decided will ever failed in carrying out this proud engagement, undertaken in early life with coolness and resolution. For a Saint Simon and for a Ninon de l'Enclos who incriminate her conduct, there are many less suspicious witnesses who come forward in her favor. "We were all surprised," says the Intendant Basville, "that anyone could unite such virtues, such poverty, and such charms." M. Lacroix invokes that note transcribed by Conrart, said to have been found in Fouquet's casket, and to have been written to him by Madame de Maintenon. "I do not know you enough to love you, and if I knew you, perhaps I should love you less. I have always avoided vice, and I naturally hate sin. But I confess to you that I hate poverty still more. I have received your 10,000 crowns. If you will bring me another 10,000 in 2 days, then I will see what I have to do." But besides the fact that Conrart ascribes to Madame de la Beaume this letter, the terms of which also contrast singularly with Madame de Maintenon's style. We know from positive proofs what were the relations both of Scarron and his wife with the family of Fouquet. If some doubts may exist with respect to Villachot, whom Saint-Simon and Ninon de l'Enclos make Madame de Maintenon's lover, no one can fail to recognize the perfect propriety and the dignity she exhibited in accepting the benefits of the surintendant. It is always to Madame Fouquet that she addresses herself, and when the latter, charmed by so much intelligence, wishes to have the wife of Scarron near her, she rejects with marvelous tact a proposition full of perils both to her virtue and, above all, to her good fame. One day, however, she was obliged, on account of Scarron's infirmities, to go herself to solicit Fouquet. "But," says Madame de Quay-Lussac, and Mademoiselle Dumas confirms the accuracy of this account, she affected to go there in such great negligence that her friends were ashamed of taking her. Everyone knows what Miss Fouquet was then, his weakness for women, and how much the highest sought to please him. This conduct, and the just admiration that it excited, reached even the Queen's ears. Extreme reserve towards the surintendant, and affectionate gratitude towards Madame Fouquet. Such were, we see, the sentiments of Scarron's widow, and far from having to cause a weakness to be forgotten, Madame de Maintenon had, on the contrary, to remember the kindnesses of this family, and for her part to contribute to the alleviation of the prisoner's lot. Afterwards, in a very vague manner, and without furnishing any positive proofs, Lahoix reminds us that Fouquet was mixed up in those famous poisoning trials which revealed so many monstrous scandals and implicated certain great personages of the court, in which, too, we see the audacity of the crime still further increased by the revolting cynicism of the avowals, and which produced a profound commotion throughout the whole of France and even abroad. That Fouquet's name may have been pronounced during the discussions, one is not prepared either to contest or feel surprised at. As his enemy, Colbert, was one of the appointed victims, and as a conspiracy seemed to have been formed to poison him, it is very natural that the accused persons should have invoked the recollection of the surintendant. But how many other names, such as those of La Fontaine and Racine, were indicated to the lieutenant of police without their reputations being tarnished by it? Lacroix, with reason, regrets that most of the papers relating to this dark business have not been documents relating to these various trials, authorizes us to accuse the surintendant. As for those which have already been published, and which include some declarations concerning Fouquet, an attentive examination of the period at which they have been made proves that they could have exercised no influence upon the fate of the prisoner of Pignerol. The woman Philastre said at the torture that she had written a contract by which the Duchess de Vivonne desired the restoration of M. Store, Fouquet, and the death of M. Colbert. But this declaration was made some months after the surintendant's death. We have a letter from Louvois to the lieutenant of police, Larreynie, in which the latter is thanked for having informed the king what one named Debray has said of the solicitation that was made to him by a man dependent on Fouquet. But this letter is dated June 17th, 1681, 15 months after the death, or, if it is preferred, the period at which Louis XIV had determined upon causing the surintendant to disappear. Would the revelations of the Marchioness de Brinvilliers be relied upon by preference? But her trial dates from 1676, and if Fouquet had been seriously compromised at that time, wherefore those successive alleviations of his punishment during a period of 4 years? In any case, if on such interested and doubtful depositions it be admitted that Fouquet's friends were the counselors and accomplices of a crime, I can understand that, struck with the coincidence, not precisely exact as we have just seen, between these accusations and the surintendant's death, the suspicion might arise that the latter was not a natural one. M. Pierre Clement, in his work, La police, sous Louis XIV, has expressed this idea with extreme circumspection and has contented himself with uttering a doubt. He accuses no one, as he is especially careful to declare. But he observes that the period at which Fouquet's death occurred rendered it an untoward event. He succumbed to an attack of apoplexy, and the nature of this complaint would go far to accredit the theory of poison, but their conjectures ought to stop. Let people hesitate to believe that he was really seized with an attack of this nature. I can conceive their doing so, although numerous reasons combine to make us place credence in it. But everything is entirely opposed to the hypothesis of his death being simulated by Louis XIV's orders. And whether it was natural or whether it was hastened by a crime, it is unquestionably true that it really took place in the month of March of the year 1680. Was it, in truth, a man in a good state of health who suddenly succumbed? It was an old man who had been ailing for the last 16 years, a man unsettled by excess of blood, a man whom the absence of every kind of exercise had rendered plethoric, and who, from a busy life and one given up for a long time to pleasure, had suddenly passed to the privations and the inaction of captivity. Was it a prisoner, malignant and full of strong resentment, who was suspected of having instigated his friends to poison Colbert? No, indeed. It was the most patient and the most resigned of captives, who had expiated his faults by the most admirable behavior, who had pardoned his enemies, and whose mind, detached from the good things of the world, was raised to the contemplation of things divine, and who, offering his own life as an example, had devoted his long leisure to erecting a monument of his piety for the edification of his fellow creatures. Did he die mysteriously without witnesses save a gaoler capable of a crime? It was in the presence of the Count de Vaux, his son, and of his daughter. It was in their arms that he yielded up his breath. Saint Mars, whom all his contemporaries represent to us as a perfectly upright man, was the sole intermediary between the king and his prisoners. Lastly, when the news of his death arrives at the court, Louis XIV immediately causes an order to be transmitted to his representatives at Pignerol to give up Fouquet's corpse to his family, in order that they may have it transported whither it may seem good to them. These are decisive and material considerations, the value of which cannot be destroyed by that crowd of secondary arguments which M. Lacroix has gathered up into a heap and put forward with very great skill, but will even these resist a strict investigation? Can one be astonished that the accounts of Fouquet's death furnished by his friends, separated from him for so long a time, should differ from one another? Is it astonishing that some should attribute his death to suffocation, others to a fit, when we know that pulmonary apoplexy is always accompanied by suffocation? Must we consider as significant the uselessness of the researches made at Pignerol by a learned Piedmontese, when he himself explains it by the suppression of the convent of Saint Clair, in which the body of Fouquet was placed for the time being, by the alterations which have taken place in the church, and the dispersion of papers belonging to this monastery? Lastly, is there anything strange in the silence of La Fontaine, in the laconism with which the Gazette and Le Mercure announce Fouquet's death, and in the absence of an ostentatious inscription in the chapel of the Convent des Filles de la Visitation, to which his body was carried? 20 years had passed away since the fall of the surintendant, but in how much shorter space of time are services forgotten! In the especially fruitful period from 1660 to 1680, other and more illustrious names had filled the world's stage and usurped fame. In that court which he had dazzled with his splendor, Fouquet had long since been forgotten, and only a few friends sympathized with his misfortunes. If he who has lent such touching language to the nymphs of Vaux was silent, if the death of his benefactor inspired him with no theme, it was not because he declined to believe in it. But rather than suppose him insensible to it, will it not be better to explain his silence as the result of indolence, and abandon the thought that La Fontaine was indifferent to Fouquet's death? If the real sentiments experienced under these circumstances by the fabulist are unknown to us, if the end of him who for so long kept a portion of the court at his feet occurred almost unperceived, he had at least the honor of being mourned by Madame de Sévigné, who was always faithful, and the consolation of being surrounded by his family on his deathbed, while even Saint Mars himself must have regretted this inoffensive and resigned prisoner. A short time after Fouquet's death, Lauzun was liberated. But a year previous to this, a few dragoons, commanded by an officer mysteriously dispatched to Pignerol, had left the citadel during the night and taken the road to Turin. Halting at an isolated inn, far from any other habitation, and situated a short distance from the little river Cisola, they penetrated inside the house, and concealed themselves with such care that their presence could not be detected. Very early the next morning a carriage containing 3 persons, 2 of whom were priests, hastily set out from Turin. Arrived at the banks of the stream, which was swollen by the rains, the travelers were obliged to dismount and traverse the torrent by means of some planks hurriedly put together. They then entered a room of the inn. Not long afterwards the armed dragoons made their way into this room and seized one of the travelers. An hour subsequently a carriage, surrounded by a cavalry escort, quitted the inn and conducted the prisoner to Pignerol. 3 days later another stranger arrived in his turn at this fatal house. Immediately surrounded and seized by the same dragoons, posted in the same spot, he was also thrown into a carriage and rapidly whirled off to Pignerol. Chapter 19. Intervention of the Kings of France in Italy. Policy of Henri II, Henri IV, and Louis XIII, judicious conduct of Richelieu, Treaty of Cherasco, menacing ambition of Louis XIV, situation of the court of Savoy on the death of Charles, Emmanuel, portrait of Charles IV, Duke of Mantua, the Marquisate of Montferrat and Casale, the Count Mattioli, his political career, his character, the Abbé d'Estrades, and Giuliani. Proposal to cede Casale to Louis XIV. Interview at Venice between Charles IV and the Abbé d'Estrades. Journey of Mattioli to Versailles. He communicates the project formed to the enemies of France. How is his conduct to be estimated? It is almost always unwisely that the kings of France have intermeddled in the affairs of Italy. Their occupations have never been lasting, because they have been in opposition to the true interests of France, and have violated natural boundary laws imposed upon the 2 countries by their geographical configurations. Charles VIII conquered the kingdom of Naples, but Louis XII lost it. The latter took possession of the Milanese, but Francois I was obliged to evacuate it, and by giving up Piedmont, which his father had made himself master of, Henri II completed this retrograde movement. After having quitted the false path into which his 3 predecessors had dragged France, Henri II indicated where the frontiers were to be enlarged, where national conquests were to be made, and what was the true direction to be given to her armies. He took Calais, thus pointing out the road to the Netherlands, and by becoming the master of the Trois-Évêchés, he opened to his successors the glorious road to Alsace and the Rhine. While he was so happily inaugurating a new struggle, he was also establishing the basis of a new policy obscurely foreseen by Francois I, but the merits of which certainly belonged to Henri II. The latter understood that the most effectual way of contending with the Emperor of Germany, the head of the Catholic party, was to ally himself with the German princes and the Reformed party, and if he was too early interrupted in his scheme by a violent death, if the minority or the weakness of his children for a long time suspended its execution, it was again undertaken, and we know with what success by Henri IV, Richelieu, Mazarin, and Louis XIV. to assure the neutrality of Spain, to watch Italy without attempting to establish himself there, to lead all his forces towards the north and the east, and to extend in this direction the frontiers, which were too near to the capital. Such was the glorious policy of Henri IV, suspended for a time after his death, but worthily continued by his successors. At the same time, it cannot be said that the latter were indifferent to the affairs of Italy. When, in 1627, the Dukes of Savoy and Guastalla, aided by the House of Austria, wished to secure to Charles de Gonzaga, the Duke of Mantua's inheritance, Louis XIII loudly proclaimed the cause of this legitimate heir, and ensured the triumph of his rights. Rendered by victory master of the destiny of the House of Savoy, Richelieu did not allow himself to be dazzled by success. This incomparable politician understood that to dispossess an Italian dynasty and to establish himself on the other side of the Alps would necessarily result in uniting the Italians to the Spaniards, in provoking against the French, who had suddenly become unpopular, even by their presence, a coalition sooner or later victorious, and creating, in fact, outside the natural sphere of action of France, incessant grounds of anxiety, jealousies, struggles, and alarms. Thus, in 1631, by the Treaty of Cherasco, the skillful minister, sacrificing many of the fruits of his victory, restored Piedmont and Savoy, contenting himself with retaining Pignerol, so as always to keep open one of the passes into Italy, to watch over her without alarming her, to be a protector of the rights of the Italian princes without menacing their independence, to exact complete confidence from them in return, to baffle the intrigues of the Spaniards, and to allow them to accumulate on themselves hatred and resentment, to assume, in a word, an attitude passive yet vigilant, firm but not menacing. Such was the judicious conduct of Richelieu towards Italy. Louis XIV long remained faithful to this policy. It was towards the north and east that he led his victorious armies, and by a succession of enterprises, happily conceived and wonderfully well conducted, he extended the frontiers of France in the proper direction, and, arbitrator of Europe at the peace of Aix-la-Chapelle, and subsequently at that of Nimeguen, he inspired her with fear and admiration. In these two cities, his will alone was the sole basis of the negotiations, while for everyone the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle had never appeared to be aught but a truce. That of Nimeguen combined all the conditions of a 14, had conceived ambitious projects on the other side of the Alps, and the possession of Pignerol and the neighboring valleys no longer appeared to him sufficient for the part he was desirous of playing in Italy. The influence of his government had, however, been better accepted there, when it was more dissembled, and when everything that could give the slightest offense had been avoided with the greatest care. But when the policy of Richelieu and Mazarin, scrupulously continued by de Leon, had ceased to prevail, when the invading and impetuous Louvois established a sort of military diplomacy, which he directed as he pleased, the sentiments of the Italians, and in particular of the Piedmontese, became somewhat modified. Confiding deference gave place to restrained apprehension, and led by degrees to a hatred which burst out against France at the moment she was oppressed by coalitions and defeats. Charles Emmanuel, Duke of Savoy, had just died, leaving as his successor a child, under the guardianship of a mother, vain, ardent, and impassioned, and whom littleness of mind as much as hastiness of character led to exaggerated resistance, soon to be followed by humiliating concessions. Instead of showing himself the disinterested protector and sincere counselor of Victor Amadeus, Louis XIV sought from that time forward to become powerful in Italy by profiting by the weakness of this government, the vanity of the regent, the inexperience of her son, and by the passions aroused in this court around a frivolous and capricious woman. By an altogether opposite line of conduct, he might have eternally attached to himself the young duke who, instead, was later to become his adversary, not the most formidable, but certainly the most inconvenient, and who was to contribute, above all others, to the diversion created in the south, to paralyze the power of France, and place her within an inch of her ruin. Victor Amadeus has been represented, and with reason, as a perfidious enemy and unreliable ally. But, in the first place, it was the conduct of his mother, and afterwards that of Louis XIV, which early disposed this prince to dissimulation. Left in retirement by a hard and ambitious regent, with his friends watched and suspected, and himself isolated, yet not a stranger to the interests of his states, taciturn but thoughtful and observant, more patient than resigned, he was submitting with apparent indifference to a double and oppressive guardianship, from which he only awaited the opportunity to escape or to be revenged. From this moment, Louis XIV himself prepared those disasters which were to mark the end of his reign. Whilst those audaciously arbitrary decisions of the Chambre de Réunion for the aggrandizement of France by conquests made in full peace profoundly irritated the north of Europe, he was about to agitate the south by pretensions equally extravagant, for a long time concealed, then boldly disclosed, and which tended to nothing less than to place a part of Italy under his exclusive dominion. The complacency, or at least the neutrality, which the vanity and weakness of the regent assured to Louis XIV in Piedmont, was rendered not less certain in Mantua by the frivolous indifference of Charles IV, its young duke. This prince, a degenerate representative of the House of Gonzaga, which has produced so many great men and mingled its blood with the most illustrious families of Europe, showed himself unworthy of his rank and of his name by the most extravagantly dissipated conduct. Careless and thoughtless, he was quite indifferent to the interests of his duchy, leaving its administration to incompetent favorites, and himself, a non-resident duke, was in the habit of spending the greater part of his existence amidst the pleasures of Venice, and only dreaming of returning to Mantua when the pressing need of money called him thither. A great gambler, and lavish in his expenditure, he had soon exhausted in fetes and adventures the remnants of a fortune and of an equally broken constitution. Anticipating the revenues of his duchy, he had just obtained from some Jews advances on the taxes for several years. This sum was soon squandered, and Charles IV, deprived of resources, but not less eager for pleasure, ruined, but not less anxious to assist at all the festivals given outside his states, was reduced to expedients, and in a manner compelled to sell himself. He was not long in finding a purchaser. Under his authority was placed the Marquisate of Montferrat, that rich and fertile country, so perpetually sought after, and the possession of which was frequently contested by arms. Taken by the Romans from the Goths, then by the latter from the Lombards, afterwards forming a portion of the Empire of the West, eventually becoming an hereditary fief, several times claimed by the House of Savoy, conquered by Charles Emmanuel, then evacuated. This country had at length been annexed to the Duchy of Mantua, from which vast states nevertheless separated it. Casale was its capital. This fortified place, situated on the Po 15 leagues to the east of Turin, was of the utmost importance, and especially to Piedmont. From very remote times the court of Turin had coveted this natural dependency, which the defeats of Louis XIV and the conduct of Victor Amadeus would one day secure to it. That the Duke of Mantua should possess this territory bordering on Piedmont was no doubt an anomaly, but was scarcely dangerous. The King of France, on the contrary, being already master of Pignerol, on securing possession of Casale, would in reality enclose the court of Turin between two formidable places, of which the one to the southwest gave access to the passage of the Alps, and the other, to the northeast, commanded the road to the Milanese. This was the project formed by Louis XIV. The intrigue was mysteriously commenced in 1676, but for a long time previously he had turned his attention to this important town. On September 17, 1665, a few days subsequent to the death of Charles III, the preceding Duke of Mantua, he had hastened to send to the regent, mother of Charles IV, the Sieur d'Aubeville, instructed to insist that no change should be tolerated in the garrison of Casale during the minority of the young duke. This demand, which was very natural on account of the contiguity of the Spaniards, seemed, and perhaps was at the time, extremely disinterested. In 676, however, he no longer troubled himself with the maintenance of a Mantuan garrison at Casale, but rather with throwing the place open to his own troops. One of the great personages of Mantua was Ercole Antonio Mattioli. He was born at Bologna, December 1st, 1640, and belonged to an old and distinguished family of the long robe. His grandfather, Constantino Mattioli, had been raised to the dignity of senator. One of his uncles, Ercole Mattioli, a Jesuit father, was a very celebrated orator. He himself early attracted attention by obtaining, when only 19 years of age, the prize in civil and canon law, and shortly afterwards the title of professor at the University of Bologna. He subsequently made himself still further known by several much-prized works, and after having formed an alliance with an honorable senatorial family of Bologna, established himself at Mantua, where his talents, dexterity, and early maturity caused him to be appreciated by Duke Charles III. De Gonzaga, one of whose secretaries of state he became. After this prince's death, his son Charles IV. De Gonzaga, when he attained his majority, accorded his friendship to Mattioli, whom he named supernumerary senator of Mantua, a dignity to which the title of count was attached. Filled with ambition, Mattioli not only hoped to reacquire the office of Secretary of State, but also to become the principal minister of his young master. Knowing his position to be most precarious, he was ardently desirous of rendering him one of those signal services which justify the highest rewards, and an occasion offered itself during the latter months of the year 1677. The Abbé d'Estrades, then ambassador of Louis XIV, to the Venetian Republic, was as ambitious and as restless as Mattioli. Belonging to a family of diplomats and anxious to become illustrious in his turn, he had the cunning to enter resolutely into the views of the court of Versailles, and knowing very well, moreover, that his conduct would be approved, to concoct the intrigue which was to end in the cession of Casale to the King of France. Having long since been acquainted with the condition of the court of Mantua, and with the individuals holding the chief rank in it, he cast his eyes upon Mattioli as being, from his character, the most likely to embrace the project of surrender, and, by using his influence over his master, to induce him to adopt it. But before entering directly into communication with Mattioli, he sent to Verona, where the latter frequently resided, one Giuliani, a perfectly sure man, whom his occupation of journalist obliged to travel from place to place to collect news, and whose stay at Verona consequently would not excite suspicion. Giuliani had Mattioli watched, and, observing him himself, ascertained his aversion to the Spaniards, from whom he had never received anything but hopes. By degrees the connection became closer, and Giuliani was able to indicate to him without danger the plans of the Abbé d'Estrades, the pecuniary advantages which the Duke of Mantua would derive from the surrender of Casale to Louis XIV, and the security as well as the honor of an alliance with so powerful a sovereign. Mattioli leapt at the proposition and undertook to expound it to the Duke, whom he had no great difficulty in convincing. The intercourse soon became more direct. Giuliani saw Charles IV at Mantua, and it was agreed that an interview between the latter and the Abbé d'Estrades might take place at Venice with all the more secrecy, as, in consequence of the carnival, everyone, even the Doge, the oldest senators, the cardinals, and the nuncio, goes about masked. Louis XIV. and M. de Pomponne, his minister, congratulated the Abbé d'Estrade with effusion on the propitious commencement of this delicate negotiation, and on January 12, 1678, the king himself did not disdain to write to Count Matthioli in order to thank him. Matthioli and Charles IV, in fact, proceeded to Venice. They first discussed with the abbé the price of the surrender, which was fixed at 100,000 crowns, payable after the exchange of the ratifications of the treaty, and in two sums at 3 months' interval. At midnight on March 13, 1678, the ambassador of the King of France and the Duke of Mantua met, as if by chance, in the middle of a public square on leaving a ball, and there, away from every inquisitive ear, and concealed from every glance by a mask similar to those then worn by all noblemen at Venice, conversed for quite an hour concerning the conditions of the treaty, the payments of the stipulated price, and the manner in which Louis XIV should defend Charles IV against the effects of the resentment of the Venetian Republic and the Spaniards. Distrustful as were the Italian princes, disposed as the Venetian Republic may have been to suspect an intrigue and prevent so dangerous an intervention as that of the King of France in the north of Italy, numerous and accomplished as were the spies who swarmed in Venice, it was in this same city, almost under the very eyes of the representatives of the different powers, that the bases of a treaty which was one of the most menacing to the independence of the peninsula were settled in a mysterious and impenetrable manner, with the same precautions, and always without attracting the attention of the other princes. Charles IV saw the Abbé d'Estrade several times afterwards. It was arranged between them that Matthioli should proceed secretly to France, and that he should sign at Versailles, in the name of his master, the definitive treaty which would permit Louis XIV to penetrate into the north of Italy. This journey of Matthioli's was delayed for some months, first by a rather lengthened illness which kept him at Mantua, then by Louis XIV's desire to defer till the following spring, that is, till April 1679, the dispatch of his troops to Casale. At the end of October 1678, Count Matthioli and Giuliani, in order to avert suspicion, announced their intention of paying a visit to Switzerland and, in fact, proceeded thither, traversed it, and arrived in Paris on November 28. At once placed in communication with M. de Pomponne, Minister of Exterior Relations, they discussed, and drew up in the most profound secrecy, the Treaty of Cession which was signed on December 8th, and which stated, first, that the Duke of Mantua should receive French troops into Casale; second, that he should be named Generalissimo of any French army which Louis XIV might send into Italy; third, and that after the execution of the treaty the sum of 100,000 crowns should be paid to the prince. Immediately after the signing of this document, Matthioli was received by Louis XIV with the most flattering distinction in a secret audience. The king presented him with a valuable diamond in remembrance of his visit, caused him to be paid 400 double louis, and promised him that after the ratification of the treaty he should receive a much larger sum for his reward, as well as a place for his son among the king's pages, and a rich abbey for his brother. No intrigue was ever better conducted or had more chances of success. In Piedmont a court divided, powerless, and almost servilely devoted to France. In the remainder of Italy, as in Piedmont, princes kept in the most complete ignorance. In Mantua, a duke perfectly ready to sell a portion of his states. Lastly, the two ambassadors charged with the negotiation of this affair, having an equal interest in its success, since it would enrich one and assure to both the gratitude of their masters and a high position. 2 months after Matthioli's visit to France, the courts of Turin, Madrid, and Vienna, the Spanish governor of the Milanese, and the state inquisitors of the Venetian Republic, that is to say, all those who were most interested in opposing this project, were acquainted with the minutest details of it, and were ignorant neither of the price to be paid for the surrender, the time at which it was to take place, nor the names of the negotiators. In one word, They knew everything, for at different times they had received the confidence of the better informed of the participators in this intrigue, of Count Matthioli himself. By what motive was he actuated? Must we see in this treason an act inspired by base cupidity? Was Matthioli a rogue who, after having received Louis XIV's money, proceeded to sell himself by turns to the Austrians, the Spaniards, the Venetians, and the Piedmontese? Or, disquieted in mind and suddenly struck by the apparition of his country in danger, was he seized with remorse at the moment of bartering her away, and did he seek the only means of preserving her from the encroachments of an ambitious king? Was he an intriguer, a low informer, or a man struggling between two opposing sentiments, whose greedy ambition had first led him to assist his master's criminal projects, and whose patriotism had then suddenly determined him to cause them to miscarry? These are questions which nobody will ever be able to answer, because nobody ever received his confidences. It is, however, worthy of remark that if cupidity alone had been Matthioli's motive, he would have stooped to the execution of the Treaty of Casale, since this offered him many more material advantages than he could hope for from a sudden change of conduct. That Matthioli should be designated a rogue in the dispatches afterwards exchanged between the court of Versailles and the French representatives in Italy is not at all astonishing. This anger was the natural consequence of a bitter disappointment. But the fact that there was room for a more noble motive, and that a patriotic inspiration was possible, is sufficient to prevent us from unreservedly condemning this man, who perhaps thought to save his country. No doubt he ought to have cast aside all the appearances of knavery, to have returned Louis XIV, his presence to have first dissuaded Charles IV, and if the latter had persisted in introducing the French army into Italy, then, and then only, to have revealed the danger to the other princes. In this case it would have been necessary to do it openly, with frankness, without dissimulation, and by informing the Abbé d'Estrades of what would have no longer been a treason, but a truly patriotic act. Was, however, such a line of conduct open to Matthioli, surrounded with spies, watched over and having to fear a power so formidable as France, and a resentment so dangerous as Louis XIV? Must we altogether blame him if he could not strip his character of all its craftiness and duplicity, and if, amid the dishonoring appearances of treason, he thought to perform an honorable act? To the present time, people have seen in him only a contemptible cheat, but however weak the contrary presumption may be, do not let us altogether reject it. Let us cease to place ourselves only in the French point of view, and by considering the peril to which Italy would have been exposed by the cession of Casale, let us not refuse to suppose that Matthioli, by preventing it, understood, perhaps, the interest of his country better than his own, and that into a mind naturally greedy, a noble and disinterested sentiment was able to penetrate. Chapter 20. The Regent of Savoy's Perplexity. She discloses Matthioli's conduct to Louis XIV. Arrival of Catinat at Pignerol, arrest of the Baron d'Asfeld and his imprisonment at Milan, the Abbé d'Estrades the first to conceive the project of Matthioli's abduction, dispatches of the Abbé d'Estrades detailing the abduction and the incarceration of Matthioli, means adopted in order to recover the official, documents connected with the negotiation, mystery surrounding Matthioli's disappearance, his family dispersed and remaining silent and powerless. The Regent of Savoy was the first to whom Matthioli gave information. On December 31st, 1678, she not only received his confidence, but also had communicated to her all the original documents relating to the negotiation and took copies of them. She was alike very pleased at knowing of this intrigue, and very much embarrassed as to the line of conduct she ought to pursue. Piedmont, indeed, had most to suffer from the surrender of Casale to Louis XIV. To oppose the execution of this project by arms was far from the wish of this princess, and far beyond the forces at her disposal. to place obstacles in the way of it exposed her to the resentment of the King of France. After having hesitated for a long time, and not doubting but that Mattioli would, without delay, make the same revelations to the Spaniards and Austrians as he had to her, she preferred to leave to Spain and to the Empire the dangerous task of arresting Louis XIV's encroaching ambition in Italy. But to preserve silence and prudently await the result of the struggle, either armed or diplomatic, which seemed likely to ensue, was not in accordance with the frivolous character and general incapacity of this princess. To whom, then, was she to confide this weighty and embarrassing secret? She was too little of an Italian to resolve to make it known at Milan, Venice, and Florence, and thus provoke a coalition of the various interests which were menaced. So it was to Louis XIV himself that she revealed Mattioli's confidences. In this manner she secured to herself the merit of obliging a powerful sovereign, whose friendship she retained without having anything to fear from him, thanks to the vigorous measures which the courts of Vienna and Madrid would be compelled to take. She deceived herself, however, in a portion of her calculations, since it was not till 2 months afterwards that Mattioli, on seeing the uselessness of his confession to the regent, and learning that Louvois was continuing his preparations for entering into Casale, resolved to inform the Austrians, Venetians, and Spaniards. If he had not done so, the King of France, meeting with no obstacle, and having received the Duchess of Savoy's valuable piece of intelligence, would have immediately taken possession of Casale. Louis XIV was greatly moved, and with reason felt very grateful to the regent for her course of action. He expresses in his dispatches sentiments of gratitude and of esteem towards the Duchess of Savoy, whilst he stigmatizes what he terms the treason of the knave. But, deceived as he had been by the one and enlightened by the other, was he in a position to judge properly the conduct of these two individuals? And, to place ourselves in another point of view to his, we may ask who most compromised the true interests of this country, the man whose information, sold, it is true, but well-timed, suddenly aroused the other princes to vigilance, or the princess who, more French than Italian, hastened to communicate this valuable confidence to Italy's most redoubtable and menacing enemy. The regent's letter reached Louis XIV in the middle of the month of February 1679. The king's disappointment and wrath were so much the more lively since his plans were already in course of execution. All those who were to play a part in the denouement of this business were not only appointed, but were actually at their posts. The far-sighted Louvois, who, previous to Napoleon, was, perhaps, the man who possessed in the highest degree the genius of organization and the spirit of detail, had drawn up, a quality in which he excelled, the whole plan of the operation. His orders, clear, precise, and minute, had been punctually followed. Numerous troops, under the command of the Marquis de Boufflers, Colonel-General of Dragoons, were assembled at Briançon ready to cross the frontier. The Baron d'Asfeld, Colonel of Dragoons, left for Venice on the mission of exchanging in that city the ratification of the treaty. Catinat, then Brigadier of Infantry, arrived from Flanders, where he had already served with distinction, and proceeded with the greatest secrecy to Pignerol. St. Mars had been enjoined to leave the postern of the citadel open, to meet himself the mysterious traveler, and to conduct him into the donjon in such a manner that nobody might be able to suspect his presence there. This sham prisoner was even obliged to change his name, and the dispatches addressed to him bore that of Richemont instead of Catinat. Everything had been marvelously well conceived, everything was prepared, everything foreseen, save what the government of Versailles termed the treason of Mattioli. Nevertheless, the Duchess of Savoy's communication did not entirely destroy Louis XIV's hopes, so he refrained from informing the Abbé d'Estrades, who had been transferred from the embassy of Venice to that of Turin. He wished to look upon these first disclosures as only a commencement of treason, An accident to be regretted, it is true, but one of which the consequences might perhaps be neutralized by exercising a pressure upon the Duke of Mantua and by endeavoring to intimidate Mattioli. But the latter had become as laconic in his letters as he was inexact in keeping his appointments. The Abbé d'Estrades, very much preoccupied with the result of a negotiation of which he had been the life and soul, only suspected a treason the full reality of which he was not yet acquainted with. He sent courier after courier to M. de Pinchesni at Venice, to Mantua for Mattioli, to the principal towns of Italy for Duke Charles IV, and from all these different places he received the most unsatisfactory intelligence. Sometimes Mattioli declared that he was detained at Verona by the state of his health. At others, Charles IV was attracted to Venice by the desire of assisting at a carousel. It was not that the Duke formally refused to execute the treaty of surrender, but that new obstacles were continually being raised by the very person who till then had undertaken the direction of this affair, by Mattioli himself, and the young prince, thoughtless and frivolous, of a very versatile disposition, and devoting himself to scarcely anything but pleasure, was very glad to endorse his favorite's views. Suddenly the news arrived at Turin that Baron d'Asfeld had been arrested by the governor of the Milanese while proceeding to Incria in order to exchange the ratifications there with Mattioli, and that he was detained a prisoner by the Spaniards. However significant this arrest may have been, the court of Versailles did not yet despair. Catinat received orders to undertake the mission at first confided to d'Asfeld, and to start for Incria, whither Mattioli was also invited to proceed. The sham Richemont, accompanied by Saint-Mars, who adopted the name and dress of an officer belonging to Pignerol, left the citadel by night and, with numerous precautions, repaired to the place of meeting. But there they awaited Mattioli in vain, and after many adventures, after having run the risk of being arrested by a detachment from the garrison of Casale, after having been compelled to appear before the governor of that place, and having preserved their incognito with difficulty, they at last returned to Pignerol, very happy at not having been recognized, but without bringing back the instrument of surrender. From this moment the doubts of the Abbé d'Estrades were changed into certainty, and it was then that he first conceived the idea of Mattioli's abduction. It is worthy of remark that it so happened with this prisoner as with Avidic. Louis XIV approved the conduct of d'Estrades as he was afterwards to ratify that of Ferriol. But it is his ambassadors who have executed the project of abduction, even before receiving the authorization for doing so. This is clear from the evidence of the dispatches which we are about to quote. It is, in truth, necessary to allow the principal author of this act of violence to speak for himself, which we shall do hereafter more than once. For, on approaching the conclusion of this work, we desire the reader to be self-convinced, and thus to participate in the pleasure which the solution of a problem affords. Having spared him long but necessary researches, we shall in future often confine ourselves to being his guide, and by now and then putting him on the right track, by contenting ourselves with indicating the goal, and furnishing the elements of the pursuit, shall leave him all the gratification and all the merit of the success of our common enterprise. On April 8, 1679, d'Estrades writes to M. de Pompon, "It is easy to discern, from what one learns on many sides, that it is owing to Mattioli's indiscretion that this affair has become public, for it would be impossible for the particulars of it, and even those of his journey to Paris, and of the stay which he made there, to be so well known if he had not talked about them. Still I am awaiting Mattioli's arrival here in order to see if one can rely upon his good faith, and if he is in a position to perform what he has promised. I shall have him so well watched that I shall know if he holds any communication with Madame de Savoy, or with the ministers, and I shall perhaps also find the means of being informed concerning what he may be treating of with them. I beg you, sir, to let me know if, in the event of there being no doubt of his perfidy, and of its being necessary to compel him by fear to put everything in train for keeping his word, the king will approve his being taken to Pignerol, which will not be at all difficult for me to accomplish without its attracting attention, because, after his arrival there, without anyone knowing that I had caused him to be abducted, it would be easy to say that he had gone of his own accord. Nevertheless, I shall not think of doing this until I have received your orders, and it would only be after having lost all hope with regard to him that we should adopt these measures." On April 22, M. de Pomponne replies to him, "Sir, I shall commence by replying to the 2 letters which you have been at the pains to write me on the 8th of the present month concerning the affair of Count Matthioli. His behavior is sufficient to make us believe that he is a rogue, but, in order to assure you the better of it, His Majesty orders me to confide to you, under the seal of secrecy, what has occurred with reference to this matter." On the occasion of his journey to Turin, he informed the Duchess of Savoy generally of the papers with which he was charged, and of everything which had been arranged with him here. He has since given the same information to the Inquisitors of Venice, and caused M. d'Asfeld to be arrested during his journey in the Milanese by the information which he gave to Count de Melgar. As he thinks that all this knavery is unknown, he has been in the habit of trifling with Mr. de Pinchesny, and you see by the letters which he writes to you that he wishes to trifle with you in the same manner. As he proposes to visit you at Turin, His Majesty does not wish you to let him know that you are acquainted with his conduct. You will continue to let him think that you are deceived, and you will make use of your apparent confidence, and of that which you will assure him the king continues to have, in order to endeavor to obtain the ratification of the treaty. He has stated at Venice that he has it in his possession. Perhaps he has it still. It is important to exert all your skill to obtain it from him. The king does not consider it advisable to cause the scandal of having him taken to Pignerol as you propose. The only case in which you could employ menaces and fear would be if you were certain that he really possessed the ratification, and you considered these means necessary in order to compel him to give it up to you. There is scarcely any room for doubt that, if he goes to Turin, he will see the Duchess of Savoy and will keep out of your way. You will not appear to take any notice of it, and you will not let this princess know that you are informed of this matter, although it is she herself who has given information concerning it to His Majesty. The same day the Abbé d'Estrades urges upon the government of Versailles the necessity of granting the authorization to kidnap Matthioli. I believe that what I have already had the honor of stating to the king proves Mattioli's perfidy sufficiently clearly. He has been here for the last 4 days, and has come to see me with great precautions, as if he had much interest in concealing himself. Nevertheless, every morning he has had conferences with a person named Tarin, who is the man that Madame R. sent to Padua to ascertain what it was he had to communicate to her. He has insinuated 1,000 falsehoods in his conversations with him. He has wished to have it believed that he saw me every day, although I have only spoken to him once, and that the Duke of Mantua had sent him here in order to declare to me that this prince could not keep his word to His Majesty on the subject of the Casale Treaty. Whilst I have been writing this dispatch, Mattioli has again come to see me, and the manner in which he has spoken to me has so clearly shown me his bad faith that, even if I could possibly have had any doubt concerning it, he would have left me in no uncertainty. He has proposed to me some ridiculous schemes which would tend only to involve His Majesty in fresh embarrassments. He has told me that he leaves tomorrow in order to have an interview with the governor of Casale, who was pressing him strongly to visit him, and who hoped that the place would soon be in the hands of the king, as he has assured me that he would return during the present week at the latest, and, as I know that a few days afterwards he is to go It is, nevertheless, so important to do this that there remains to me only to think of the means of executing the design without scandal, with the view that the rumors which would ensue should not revive those which have been caused by the affair which he was negotiating, and of its not being known what had become of him. I have thought that it was impossible for me to succeed in this, except by entrusting Madame Royale with the secret, since I could not make certain of the person of Matthioli in Turin or in the states of the Duke of Savoy, without resorting to a violence at which she would show herself offended, and by whatever pretext I might have wished to attract him towards Pignerol, this princess, whom he informs of all that passes between himself and me, would have warned him, no doubt, to take care of himself. I have seen myself compelled to act thus from what she said to me 2 days ago, that since Matthioli was here, he might dwell at Pignerol or take a stroll in France for longer than he imagined. I replied she was so enlightened